Shaquille Turner walked into Westgate Elite Bank, exuding quiet power. Yet the moment he stepped inside, he felt it. The shift, the glances, the judgment, the unspoken dismissal. They saw what they wanted to see. A man who didn't belong. A man to be turned away. What they didn't see? The name is attached to their biggest shareholder. By the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The revolving doors spin slowly as Big Shaq steps inside Westgate Elite Bank. His polished black dress shoes click against the marble floors, his tailored charcoal suit crisp, exuding quiet power. A platinum watch glints on his wrist as he adjusts his cufflinks. Confidence, authority, composure. He doesn't just walk, he owns the space. Yet the moment he enters, the atmosphere shifts. A teller stops typing mid-keystroke. A security guard straightens near the entrance, his hand hovering near his radio. A woman in a designer dress glances at Shaq, clutches her purse a little tighter, and takes an unnecessary step away. Shaq notices. He always does. But today he lets it slide. He approaches the counter, his voice smooth, commanding, but polite. "Good morning. I'd like to make a withdrawal." The teller, a blonde woman with a well-rehearsed corporate smile, barely hides her hesitation. Her name tag reads Claire. She acknowledges him, but something in her posture stiffens. "Of course, sir. Can I see your ID?" Shaq pulls out his wallet, slides a platinum banking card and government-issued ID across the counter. Claire picks them up, eyes flicking over the details. Then, she hesitates. Her grip on the card tightens. Her gaze shifts, subtle yet deliberate, toward the glass office in the back. A silent signal. Shaq follows her eyes. Behind the glass, a man in a navy blue suit, mid-40s, slick hair, leans back in a leather chair. His smirk is barely concealed. Assistant Manager Chadwick. They exchange a look, a brief unspoken understanding. Then Chadwick gives a lazy nod. Claire places the card back on the counter. "Unfortunately, sir, I'll need management approval for this type of request." Shaq doesn't blink, doesn't move. He studies her, his expression unreadable. "You haven't even checked my account." Claire holds her polite smile, but the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth betrays her. Before she can answer, the office door swings open. Chadwick steps out, adjusting his cufflinks as he approaches, his smirk now fully formed, oozing arrogance. He barely glances at the card before looking Shaq up and down. "Is there a problem here?" Shaq holds his gaze, unshaken. "Not from where I'm standing." Chadwick exhales a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Sir, are you sure you're at the right bank?" Silence. Thick, suffocating. The tension hums between them like an exposed wire. Shaq doesn't answer. He doesn't need to. His presence alone is enough to make men like Chadwick uncomfortable. And yet, behind those cold, assessing eyes, a storm is brewing. Claire places Big Shaq's platinum banking card back on the counter, her manicured fingers lingering on it for just a second too long. A flicker of hesitation crosses her face, but she masks it with the same forced corporate smile she gives to customers who don't belong here. "Sir," she says, her tone carefully measured. "Unfortunately, I can't process this request." Shaq doesn't react immediately. He studies her, calm but sharp. The weight of his presence alone should be enough to demand respect. Yet here he is, being treated like a nobody. He slides the card back toward her. "Try again." Claire's smile doesn't falter, but there's a flicker of something else now, annoyance. She taps at her keyboard, more for show than necessity, then exhales dramatically. "Like I said, sir, this transaction requires upper management approval." A few customers nearby pause their conversations. Eyes shift toward the counter. Shaq feels it, the shift in the room. He's no stranger to judgment, but this is deliberate. "You didn't check my balance, didn't verify my identity." His voice is steady, controlled, but there's an undeniable edge beneath it now. "What's the real issue here?" Before Claire can answer, a deep, smug chuckle cuts through the tension. "Something wrong here?" Assistant Manager Chadwick strides over, his navy blue suit pristine, arrogance practically dripping off him. He glances at Shaq, then at the teller, already assuming she's the one who needs saving. "Sir, I'm Chadwick, Assistant Branch Manager. Can I help?" Shaq doesn't break eye contact. "I doubt that." Chadwick feigns a laugh. "I appreciate the confidence, but I think you might be a little lost." He leans in slightly, lowering his voice like he's doing Shaq a favor. "This is Westgate's private banking division." The words hang in the air, loaded, intentional. Shaq's jaw tightens. Not surprised, not shocked, just tired. "And?" Chadwick's smile is almost pitying now. "And this isn't the right place for you." A murmur spreads across the bank floor. A woman in pearls whispers to her husband. The security guard shifts near the door, watching closely now, hand resting near his holster. Shaq feels the burn of a dozen silent assumptions in the room. He could cause a scene. He could demand to see someone with actual authority. Instead, he reaches into his inside jacket pocket and pulls out another sleek black leather card holder. He removes a business card. Crisp, embossed lettering, no nonsense. He places it gently on the counter. Chadwick glances at it. The smirk vanishes. Westgate Elite Bank, Executive Shareholder Shaquille Turner. Claire's breath catches. Chadwick blinks, his fingers twitching, his once perfect confidence suddenly wavering, and he doubles down. "That doesn't change anything." His voice is tighter now, forced. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." A tense, deafening silence. Shaq stares at him, measured, unshaken, dangerous in his composure. A sharp whistle. The security guard starts moving. Shaq exhales slowly, pressing his lips together before shaking his head. He sees exactly how this is going to play out. Without another word, he picks up his card, slides it back into his wallet, and turns toward the door. The whispers grow louder. Claire won't meet his eyes. The security guard steps closer, walking him out. And as Shaq crosses the threshold of the bank, one single thought runs through his mind. They have no idea who they just turned away. Silence clings to the air like humidity before a storm. Big Shaq adjusts the cuff of his suit, his face unreadable, his body still. He doesn't need to look around to feel the weight of a dozen stares pressing into him, judgmental, amused, indifferent. He's been here before. The security guard steps a little closer, his presence more of a warning than protection. Shaq sees it in his posture, the assumption, the expectation. Any second now they expect him to lash out, to raise his voice, argue, make a scene. Instead, he does something far worse. He gives them nothing. With a slow, controlled breath, Shaq turns away from the counter, tucks his wallet back into his jacket, and begins his walk toward the exit. The clicks of his shoes against the polished marble seem louder now, echoing in the hushed space. A couple near the VIP lounge whispers behind their hands. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit watches him over the rim of his espresso, shaking his head slightly, as if to say, "Should have known." Claire, the teller, shifts uncomfortably behind the counter, eyes fixed on her screen. But she isn't typing. Chadwick, the assistant manager, stands with his arms crossed, lips curled into a barely restrained smirk. To him, this is a victory. Shaq keeps walking. Each step is measured, controlled, but in his right fist, his fingers curl in just a little too tight. A lifetime of self-control keeps him from squeezing harder, from letting that rage seep into his expression. A single pair of eyes lingers longer than the rest. Logan, a young banker, barely in his late 20s, leans slightly out of his office cubicle. His tie is loose, his shirt sleeves slightly rolled, not yet molded into corporate arrogance. He saw what happened, and he knows it was wrong. Shaq doesn't stop, doesn't look back. But in the final moment before he steps outside, Logan takes a hesitant step forward. He opens his mouth, like he wants to say something, like he might break the silence. But the doors have already swung shut. Shaq steps out onto the sidewalk. The late afternoon sun hits him harder than expected. His jaw tightens as he inhales slowly through his nose. For a long second, he just stands there. Still. Breathing. Reining it all in. Then he reaches into his pocket. He pulls out his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Dials. Puts it to his ear. A beat. Then another. The call connects. Shaq exhales once, slowly before speaking. Yeah, it happened again. A pause. The response on the other end is unheard, but Shaq's expression hardens. His grip on the phone tightens. And then, the hint of a smirk. Not amusement. Not joy. Something else entirely. Something that says, they made a mistake. And they have no idea who they just turned away. The air inside Westgate Elite Bank feels different. A murmur snakes through the room, quiet but urgent, like a fire catching dry leaves. It starts with a whisper. One of the tellers, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses, leans toward his coworker, his voice barely audible. That guy, doesn't he look familiar? Claire, still flustered from her encounter with Shaq, barely acknowledges him. She's too busy avoiding Chadwick's gaze, trying to steady her hands as she organizes the stack of documents she should have processed. What are you talking about? She mutters, but the young teller is already turning toward his monitor. He types, a few clicks, a frown, more clicks, and then he stops. His face drains of color. His breathing slows as his eyes scan the screen again and again, as if trying to convince himself he's seeing it wrong. But the name doesn't change. Shaquille Turner. His throat goes dry. He leans closer to the screen, scrolling, scanning the file that just appeared before him. No. No way. His chair scrapes against the marble as he stands abruptly. The sound catches the attention of Denise, the floor supervisor, who's been casually sipping her coffee by the back office. She raises an eyebrow. Everything all right? The young teller doesn't answer. Instead, he rushes toward the main terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he pulls up another screen. Denise sets down her coffee. Something about his urgency makes her uneasy. She steps forward just as he turns toward her, his face ashen, hands trembling slightly. He swallows hard. Then, he slowly points at the screen. Denise frowns as she leans in, eyes flicking across the monitor. And then she stops breathing. Her stomach plummets. Oh my God. She doesn't hesitate. Doesn't even blink before she pivots and rushes toward the executive offices. Her heels clap against the marble, sharp, hurried, urgent. Meanwhile, Chadwick, still smugly satisfied, is patting himself on the back over how he just put a nobody in his place. He turns to Claire, his voice dripping with condescension. Now that, Claire, is how you handle people like... Slam. The office door bursts open. Denise storms out, her face pale, her hands shaking. She doesn't even glance toward the front counter as she pushes past Chadwick, past the tellers, past the security guard, her focus locked on one office, the CEO's. Chadwick barely gets out a confused "what the hell?" before she's already knocking, no, banging, on the glass door. Inside, CEO Robert Langston barely looks up from his desk, one hand flipping through financial reports, the other stirring a black espresso. He's an imposing man in his mid-50s, the kind of executive who never rushes, never panics, until today. Because the moment he sees Denise's face through the glass, something in his gut tells him something is very, very wrong. He sets down his espresso. Come in. Denise doesn't hesitate. She pushes the door open, nearly breathless. Sir, we have a situation. Langston leans back in his leather chair, unimpressed. A situation? He repeats, voice calm, slow. Denise grips the edge of his desk, trying to steady herself. A customer? No, not just a customer. A shareholder. One of our biggest shareholders was just here. Langston's expression doesn't change, not yet. And? Denise inhales sharply. Her next words land like a bomb. Shaquille Turner. Silence. Langston doesn't blink, doesn't speak, doesn't breathe. For a full second, the world seems to stop. Then, his face drains of color. The name hits like a hammer to the chest. His hands, once calm and composed, tighten into fists on the desk. Denise swallows. She's never seen him like this. Langston's voice, when he finally speaks, is deadly quiet. Tell me you're joking. Denise slowly shakes her head. Sir, he just walked out. Langston feels his heartbeat slam against his ribs. He suddenly remembers the meeting from 3 months ago. The private conference call. Shaquille Turner, major shareholder, multi-millionaire investor, a man who owns part of the very institution they just kicked him out of. Langston's fingers tremble as he reaches for his phone, and then it rings. He barely gets out a shaky hello before a booming voice from corporate headquarters cuts through the line. Langston, what the hell is going on at your branch? The blood in Langston's veins turns ice cold. You heard? A humorless chuckle on the other end. He called us personally. And let me tell you, he didn't sound happy. Langston pushes back from his desk so fast his chair topples over. Denise flinches. Panic spreads. Tellers whisper. Chadwick, oblivious until now, finally notices the tension infecting the room. He frowns. Why is everyone acting like... Then his eyes land on Langston, who is already rushing toward the exit, face pale as death. Something drops in Chadwick's stomach. No. Claire clamps a hand over her mouth. Security stiffens, and every single employee in that bank realizes they just turned away the wrong man. Robert Langston had never run in his life, not for a deal, not for a crisis, not even when a stock crash had wiped out millions in assets overnight. But today, he ran. The glass doors of Westgate Elite Bank exploded open as Langston charged onto the sidewalk, nearly colliding with a pedestrian. His Italian leather shoes pounded against the pavement as he scanned the street, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Shaquille Turner was already near the curb, his tall, commanding frame silhouetted against the setting sun. He stood still, calm, unreadable, holding his phone to his ear as if nothing had happened. Langston didn't hesitate. Mr. Turner. His voice cracked, but he didn't care. Please, wait. Shaq didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him, didn't even flinch. Inside the bank, Claire and Chadwick stood frozen, their faces drained of color. Chadwick's smirk was long gone, replaced by a sickly look of realization. His fingers dug into the counter's edge as he watched the CEO, the most powerful man in the building, chasing after the man he had just humiliated. Claire pressed a shaking hand to her lips. Langston reached Shaq just as he opened the door to a sleek black Rolls-Royce parked at the curb. A chauffeur in a dark suit stood waiting, his gloved hands ready to pull the door open. The CEO's chest heaved, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie loosened from his sprint. He hadn't had to beg in years, but right now, he would. Mr. Turner, please, let us fix this. Shaq finally moved. Slowly, so painfully, deliberately slow. He turned his head. Langston felt it before he saw it. The sheer weight of his gaze, the way the world seemed to tilt under his stare. The kind of power that came not from money, not from status, but from knowing you own the ground beneath another man's feet. Langston swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his pulse hammering. That wasn't supposed to happen, he stammered. I mean, if I had known it was you. Shaq's eyes narrowed. If you had known? Langston stopped. The words hung in the air, exposed, ugly, undeniable. Shaq let the silence stretch, let it smother the man standing before him. Langston shifted uncomfortably, his polished shoes scuffing the pavement. Inside the bank, tellers and clients watched in stunned silence. Some had their phones out, recording, capturing the moment. The CEO of Westgate Elite Bank, standing helpless before the man they had just thrown out. Langston exhaled shakily, composing himself, grasping at what little power he had left. Mr. Turner, I can personally assure you that what happened in there... He hesitated, realizing there was no way to spin it. It was a mistake. Shaq's expression didn't change. Langston pushed forward. Please, come inside. Let's fix this. I'll handle it personally. Shaq let out a small, humorless laugh. Langston paled. Shaq finally spoke, his voice low, even, but sharp enough to cut through bone. Let me ask you something, Mr. Langston. The CEO stiffened. If I didn't own shares in your bank, would you still be out here? Langston froze. A simple question. One that had no right answer. A question that said, I already know the truth. I just want to hear you choke on it. Langston opened his mouth, closed it, A bead of sweat slid down his temple. Shaq held his gaze a second longer before turning to his chauffeur. "Open the door." The chauffeur nodded, reaching for the handle. Langston panicked. "Wait!" His voice cracked, his composure slipping like sand through his fingers. He took a desperate step forward, his hands out in front of him. "We can do better. I can do better. Let us prove that." Shaq didn't move, didn't respond. Langston felt the walls closing in, the weight of every watching eye, every recording phone, every whispering customer crushing down on him. He had to give Shaq something big, something that would keep this moment from becoming a headline. "I'll fire them." The words tumbled out before he could rethink them. Chadwick, the teller, whoever else was involved, they're gone. Consider it done. Shaq finally turned back, but there was no relief in his face. No victory, just something colder, heavier, more dangerous. "You think firing a few employees fixes the problem?" Langston's stomach dropped. Shaq stepped closer. For the first time in his career, Langston felt small. "Tell me, Mr. Langston." Shaq's voice was low, controlled. "How many other mistakes have happened in this bank? How many people walked out of those doors with their dignity in their hands because they didn't own a piece of your institution? How many times did you fix it by sweeping it under the rug?" Langston had no answer. Shaq let the silence strangle him. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he glanced back at the bank. His eyes locked on Logan, the young banker who had been watching the whole time, the only one who had looked uneasy. "You." Logan straightened, stunned. He pointed at himself, unsure. "Yes, you." Shaq gestured toward the bank. "Come here." Logan hesitated, then quickly pushed through the doors, stepping onto the sidewalk. Langston tensed, watching this unfold with growing dread. Shaq turned back to him, expression still unreadable. "You want to fix this? Fire the people who let it happen. Promote the ones who knew it was wrong." Logan's eyes widened. Langston's mouth went dry. This wasn't just about an apology. This was a power shift. Shaq gave Langston a choice. Protect the ones who upheld his toxic system or prove, right now, that change was coming. Langston's fingers twitched at his sides. His whole body screamed at him to reject the idea. But he also knew something else. If he lost Shaquille Turner's trust, he wouldn't just lose a shareholder. He'd lose everything. With a deep, defeated inhale, Langston turned toward Logan. "Starting Monday, you're promoted." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Logan's mouth parted in shock. Chadwick, still frozen inside the bank, stumbled back, his face a mask of horror. Shaq gave the smallest of nods. Then, without another word, he stepped into his car. The door shut. Langston could only watch as the Rolls-Royce pulled away, disappearing into the evening traffic. The CEO turned back toward the bank, feeling the weight of his own decisions settle on his shoulders. Inside, Chadwick was already reaching for his things. And Logan? Logan was standing taller than he ever had before. Langston stood frozen outside Westgate Elite Bank, his breath still uneven, his perfectly pressed suit now creased from the sprint he had just made. The crowd around him was still, watching, waiting. The tension in the air had shifted, and for the first time in his long career, he wasn't the man holding the power in the conversation. That power belonged to Shaquille Turner. The black Rolls-Royce had pulled to a stop just inches from the curb, its engine humming like a lion waiting to pounce. Shaq stood beside the open door, one hand resting against the frame, the other adjusting the sleeve of his suit. He was in no rush. The world could wait. Langston swallowed the lump in his throat, his mind scrambling for control. He knew that if Shaq left now, it wouldn't just be a PR nightmare. It would be a complete and utter catastrophe. They had turned away a man who could bury this bank with a single phone call. Langston forced a breath through his nose, steadied himself, and stepped forward, hands raised in an appeasing gesture. Every single employee, every high-profile client still inside, was watching. "Mr. Turner, please," Langston said, his voice quieter now, measured. He had learned his lesson. No arrogance, no excuses. Just surrender. Let us make this right. Shaq finally looked at him, eyes dark and unreadable. A king measuring the worth of a subject before deciding if they deserved mercy. Langston continued, trying to keep his voice smooth, controlled. I'll personally ensure that you receive the VIP treatment you deserve. A private banker, an executive account liaison. Whatever you need, consider it done. Shaq let the words hang in the air. Then, slowly, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You think I came here for VIP treatment? The words were soft, lethal, devastating. Langston stiffened. Shaq tilted his head slightly, glancing over Langston's shoulder, back into the bank where Chadwick and Claire stood motionless, faces pale as ghosts. Chadwick looked like a man who had just realized his entire career was over, but was still too stunned to fully process it. Shaq's eyes lingered for just a moment before returning to Langston. This isn't about me. It never was. Langston opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Shaq took a step forward. The movement was slow, unthreatening, yet the shift in power was absolute. Langston had spent years mastering the art of corporate dominance, controlling rooms with the weight of his presence alone. But now he was the one drowning in silence. Shaq let the pause stretch. He knew what was happening here. Langston needed a way out, a deal, some kind of negotiation. But Shaq wasn't here to make a deal. He was here to make a point. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, before speaking again. How many other people have walked out of here with their dignity in their hands because they didn't have the power to call you out on it? Langston flinched. The murmurs in the bank grew louder. Clients were watching now, murmuring amongst themselves. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He just let the truth settle over everyone like a weight they could no longer ignore. And then, another voice. A new one. Langston turned sharply. Logan. The young banker stood just outside the doors, his hands clenched into nervous fists at his sides. He looked at Shaq, then back at his own boss. His face was tight, but his voice was steady. I knew it was wrong, Logan said, finally stepping forward. I saw it happen and I didn't say anything, and I should have. The air cracked like glass under pressure. Chadwick's expression twisted. Logan, he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. Watch yourself. Logan ignored him. His eyes were locked onto Shaq's, and for the first time since this started, something shifted. Recognition. Shaq nodded once. Not approval. Acknowledgement. Langston knew what was happening. He wasn't just losing Shaq's favor. He was losing the room. His staff. His clients. His control. If he didn't act now, this moment, this single moment, would define his entire career. Langston cleared his throat, forcing himself to stand tall. Logan, he said, his voice low but controlled. You're right, and I appreciate your honesty. He turned back to Shaq, choosing his next words carefully. You're also right, Mr. Turner. This bank has operated under outdated policies for far too long. That ends today. Shaq raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Langston inhaled deeply, then turned back toward the glass doors of his bank. He lifted a hand and pointed directly at Chadwick. You're fired. The bank went silent. Chadwick's mouth fell open. Sir, You heard me. Langston snapped, his voice suddenly sharp, commanding. The power shift had begun, but he wasn't about to let himself drown. If he was going to survive this, he had to act decisively. He turned to Claire. Pack your things. Claire's breath hitched. Sir, please, Langston shook his head. No excuses, no negotiations. This bank doesn't tolerate discrimination, not anymore. Chadwick was seething, his face red with rage, but there was nothing he could do. Not with the entire staff, the clients, and the man he had disrespected most of all standing right there, watching it happen. Shaq watched all of it unfold, his expression still unreadable. Langston turned back to Logan. You, he said. Come inside. Logan hesitated. Sir, you're promoted, Langston said simply. If you're going to be part of this company, you'd better start making decisions that matter. Logan blinked, stunned. Yes, sir. Shaq finally let out a slow breath, his gaze flicking from Logan back to Langston. Langston waited. For approval. For acknowledgement. For some kind of sign that he had salvaged this mess. Shaq gave him none of it. Instead, he took one last glance around, at the silent crowd, the stunned employees, the weight of a system that had finally begun to crack. Then, without another word, he turned, slid into the Rolls-Royce and pulled the door shut. The engine purred. The car pulled away from the curb, and Langston exhaled the longest breath of his life. The black Rolls-Royce slid through the city streets, its polished exterior reflecting the neon lights of passing buildings. Inside, Shaquille Turner sat in contemplative silence, his posture relaxed but his mind sharp, cutting through the events of the past hour like a knife through silk. His fingers tapped idly against the leather armrest, his eyes fixed on the blur of traffic outside. They thought today was about humiliation. They thought this was about a single transaction. They had no idea. Langston had panicked, scrambling to patch up the disaster he had allowed to unfold inside Westgate Elite Bank. He fired Chadwick and Claire, promoted the young banker, Logan, and tried to clean his hands of the situation before it could stain him any further. But Shaq wasn't fooled. Firing employees didn't erase a system designed to keep men like him at the door. Shaq exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back, letting the weight of it settle. He had expected resistance today. He had expected the same cold treatment he had seen so many times before. What he hadn't expected was how easy it had been to shake the foundation of one of the most powerful private banks in the city. One miscalculation on their part, one moment of arrogance, and they had crumbled in front of him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it, glancing at the name flashing across the screen. Garrett Reynolds. He let it ring twice before answering. "I assume you've heard." A deep chuckle came from the other end. "Heard? Hell, it's all over the place already. Westgate Elite just took the biggest hit to their reputation in years. The board is in meltdown mode." Garrett paused. "Langston called me directly. He's scrambling to control the narrative, offering press statements, internal reforms. He's desperate." Shaq smirked. "Desperate men make the best deals." A pause. "You really planned all of this, didn't you?" Garrett's voice was laced with curiosity, maybe even admiration. Shaq didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his wristwatch, the hands moving in smooth, precise motion. Timing, always about timing. Then he said, "People like Langston don't change because they see the error of their ways. They change because they realize their power isn't as secure as they thought." Garrett exhaled sharply. "So what now? You just walk away?" "You got your point across." Shaq leaned his head back against the seat, a slow smile playing at his lips. "Garrett, when have you ever known me to play for small victories?" The silence stretched on the line for a moment, and then Garrett laughed. "You're going for the kill, aren't you?" Shaq's fingers drummed lightly against his knee. "Langston's scrambling, but this is bigger than him. Westgate Elite isn't just a bank. It's a symbol. A system that's long overdue for a reckoning. They put a price tag on access, on respect. I intend to rewrite the rules of that system." Garrett whistled low. "You know this won't just be a fight in the boardroom. The old money executives, they're not going to sit back and let you disrupt their empire." Shaq smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Then they'll learn what it feels like to be the ones left standing outside the door." The car pulled up to a private high-rise, the driver stepping out to open Shaq's door. He pocketed his phone and stepped onto the pavement, breathing in the cool night air. He glanced up at the towering structure before him, one of the many buildings he owned but never put his name on. Ownership was power, but discretion? That was control. Inside the penthouse, lights flickered on as he entered. The space was sleek, modern, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling city below. He made his way to the bar cart, pouring himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the glow of the city lights. As he took a slow sip, his gaze landed on a file resting on the glass table near the sofa. A thick, leather-bound dossier with the Westgate Elite emblem embossed on the cover. The contents inside weren't just financial reports. They were blueprints, strategies, leverage. Shaq had been planning this for months. This wasn't just about Westgate. It was about every institution that functioned under the illusion that power was permanent. He reached for the file, flipping it open to the first page. Inside were names, executives, board members, power players. People who had spent years stacking the system in their favor, believing their money made them untouchable. Shaq traced a name with his finger, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. Langston was just the beginning. He had forced an apology today. Tomorrow, he was going to force a shift in the entire industry. And by the time they realized what he had done, it would be too late. They thought they could turn him away. They thought power belonged to them. But Shaquille Turner doesn't play by their rules. He rewrites them. What happens when the man they tried to humiliate holds the keys to their entire empire? When a simple mistake turns into their worst nightmare? This wasn't just about a bank. This was about reckoning. And Shaq? He's just getting started. Stay tuned.